If I come over to your table, does that mean I'm innocent? Just a thought, since my lawyer ain't showed up yet. He's probably stuck in the elevator somewhere. Kind of reminds me of the Three Stooges, sorry. Which one gets to be Mo?
Everyone is wondering what's happened. Of course, it's a small town, and you just don't think things like this are going to happen here. And everyone's just concerned, and our hearts go out for the families.
Family members mill about as sheriff's deputies, the Division of Criminal Investigation, an Altoona rescue crew, and then Des Moines Crime Scene Mobile Command descend on the farmstead. Tonight, hope for a break in the case. Investigators want to find a red 1995 Chevy Tahoe. The sheriff's office believes a man named Russell Overland is driving this truck. The big question tonight, could Russell Overland explain what led investigators to spend much of the night digging in the elderly couple's backyard?
Russ, about when the last time you saw your folks, saw your dad and your stepmom?
Well, let's see. I'm pretty sure I talked with him Saturday because I carried some corn in the house.
Where you been living?
Just, since September, I've been staying at the camper at my dad's place.
Who else lives there?
Where?
It's your dad's place.
Just my dad and my stepmom.
Overland's history is consistent with somebody who is displaying a parasitic lifestyle. He hasn't been able to hold down jobs consistently. He has not only employment instability because of his work performance, but because interpersonally, he doesn't seem mature enough to realize how you handle interactions with bosses. He's in his 50s living on his parents' property in a trailer that they own.
So you're saying on Sunday you didn't see your dad and Naomi at all that day?
No. I know they went to church because the car was gone.
You watch the news? Watch TV on the way down? When you stop at the motel, I'm assuming you watch the news?
Just the weather, basically.
Your dad and your stepmom were found dead.
Really?
Yeah. What can you tell us about it?
I was kind of hoping to play dumb, but obviously playing dumb
Isn't
only
gonna
gets
work.
you so far. You found them, the bodies, right?
The reaction of, really, is not a normal reaction to finding out your parents are dead. Even if he maintained he didn't kill them or tried to pretend that he didn't, that reaction is just, it's incredibly telling. The detective knows what's going on just from that.
He's sitting back in his chair, almost twiddling his thumbs. Then he asks the question, so you found them, or you found the bodies? So then he turns around to poking to see how much do they know. Someone with psychopathy, they like to control the situation. They want to slowly dispense the information they have because it will all be about them. It's going to make them work.
Where do you suppose we found him?
I know exactly where you found them.
Can you tell me where we found him?
In a cistern.
Can you tell me what happened?
I killed them. hate my stepmom.
You do?
I honestly say that I can really, truly say that I hate her.
What about your dad?
She made me feel unwelcome in the house.
Why don't you tell us the details of how it happened?
I beat him to death with a baseball bat.
There's no remorse in what he describes. It's as if he's just giving the facts. It happened this way, almost if you were narrating what was on a video. It's sort of this commentary on his own actions that's really indifferent and detached.
I had enough. When I got back from church, I did it in the back porch.
Were you waiting for him to come home from church?
I was waiting for him. Naomi came in first. I was waiting by the deep freeze. She walked up and I came at her right away with the baseball bat. Anyway, Father came after that, came through the door and says, "What the hell's going on here?" And I didn't really have a good explanation for him.
How many times do you think you hit her altogether?
Dozen, 15, whatever.
Overland's description of a fairly gruesome crime and the amount of effort that it took for him to kill his stepmother and his father is, again, just very matter of fact. He's not fazed by the fact that he was violently involved in any kind of interaction with them. But the fact that he returned to his stepmother and then beat her the number of times that he did suggests that in that moment he lost control and the only emotions he was in touch with were his anger and rage towards her.
What'd you do after that, Russ?
There was a blade on the front of the loader that he used for pushing snow. I took that off, 2 bolts, used the loader, did Naomi first, put her in the well. Had a hard time getting Father out the other door.
Did you have them both in the loader or just her?
One at a time.
One at a time. Did her and then him?
Ladies first.
I think a lot of his odd attempts at humor are much more for his own enjoyment, the kind of in-jokes with himself, and less for the detectives. His ladies first, with a little bit of emotion, kind of a chuckle almost. That's concerning. It's callous. When we see emotion, it's dark.
I had a half, kind of what I intended on doing was moving out of county, and I didn't know whether I'd be able to do it or not, but get my dad's checking account transferred to another bank, and then I was going to try and use his Social Security checks.
Okay.
Because I figured I could forge his name, you know. Naomi, I don't look like Naomi, but I do have her middle name. She writes like a serial killer.
She writes like one?
She has got a very poor penmanship.
Oh, yeah?
The statement that his stepmother wrote like a serial killer is another demonstration of a really glib attitude. On the one hand, glorifying his actions, and on the other hand, he's really reducing his stepmother's reputation and her existence down to something that justifies his behavior.
Russ, was there anything that was the straw that broke the camel's back, or just Sunday morning you decided that was the day?
I have been thinking about doing her in for probably 4 years or better. I was not welcome in the house. She thought that I smelled. She had a note on the door that said remove shoes. But she basically made it clear to me that she thought that I was raised like a heathen, because the way she put it, she said to my dad several times, "Didn't your mother ever tell you to take your shoes off? You kids must have just run in the house filthy." I have a plastic tub, and I use that to pee in, and then I dump it in the morning when I get outside. But I put a shirt over the top of it to cover it or whatever. But she basically said that your bed sheets and your room Smells like a rest area or an outhouse.
He's complaining that she's saying that it's making the place smell like an outhouse. Or the simple fact to ask him to take shoes off coming into the house. This is enraging to him. We think that those kinds of things reflect a very, very fragile ego on the person's part. They feel insulted very easily because he thinks what he's doing is just fine.
I'm in trouble with credit cards, and they were going after my dad's property because he had my name on the will that I would inherit it. So they were going to put a lien against it. So that made my dad mad, and he had to end up paying $6,500 to settle that bill. So that's another reason that I'm sure that Naomi hated me, because I was a bum. But I am a bum. I've been living off my dad. You know, really I've been staying in a camper at my dad's place, but it's poor living, if you want to call it that.
He owns the phrase, I'm a bum. There's some kind of self-loathing there that he's in the circumstances he's in. I'm wondering how much that financial reality is what kind of catalyzed it happening when it happened. Because suddenly he couldn't just cruise maybe the way he had.
Between the low self-esteem from my dad and the negative feelings, feedback I'm getting from her, I truly say that I don't miss either one. I realize what I've done is bad, but like it's to me, it's a camel or a straw that broke the camel's back. She just basically made me feel as unwelcome as the plague.
Sounds like this is kind of building up over a period of time then.
It has. I have been literally thinking about it for at least 4 years. Because if I want to admit to it, I think I truly hate her.
Okay. You're being honest, it sounds like.
Russ, did anybody talk you into doing this to your dad and stepmom?
My own idea.
Did it on your own?
My first, long time ago, I was thinking about smothering them in bed when they was asleep. But I didn't really know how effective it would be, you know, doing them both at the same time. So then my next thought was to get them while they're both watching Wheel of Fortune. In my way of thinking, I didn't think that I could do them separately. I might be able to do Father first and then Naomi. But I thought if I took her out of the picture first, I'd have to do Father.
Overland's planning is somewhat half-baked. He doesn't really think through the logistics of how he's going to live on the run. He spends 4 years lying in wait in his head, trying to plot out the perfect way to get rid of them. But even there, you hear this lack of effort. He didn't want to have to struggle to do it. And then ultimately, he decides on a Sunday, while they're at church, that that's the day he's going to do it. And he lays in wait for them to come home and then bludgeons them both to death.
Simple logistics or whatever, try to do the most effective job. I was going to do her 2 weeks ago with the axe. I thought, well, now I ain't sure how effective a baseball bat would be. You know, solid. One good whack. Not that I'm trying to be Lizzie Borden.
Lizzie Borden is a well-known case of a woman who in the 1890s killed her own father and stepmother and stood trial for that. And the fact that Overland chooses to draw that parallel, I think, speaks to his own ego. He's proud of what he's done. This is somewhat self-aggrandizing. He's making himself important. He's making himself elevated in terms of his status.
But I did dump Naomi in the well. She was still alive. And to me, that gave me great pleasure. She was still struggling. She was still semi-conscious. She wasn't dead yet.
Did she say anything?
Not that I recall. and groaning or whatever.
She went in first.
Yeah, head first. In fact, I had a little trouble getting her arms, because her arms kind of butterfly pattern, so I had to kind of play with her a little bit to get her right arm to go down. But plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is.
The idea of being thrown into a well while you're still alive, horror movies are made on the topic. It's something that most people have a very strong emotional reaction to. He's talking about how much joy he took from it. That's some impressive sadism.
I suppose I should be more remorseful. I have mildly thought several times of suicide, but I'm too chicken to try anything. I thought about hanging myself in the barn several times, but I'm too scared to do it. I thought, I've seen it on movies, I don't know if it actually worked, but I thought if you toss a radio in the bathtub, would it actually kill you? I think it would if you was in a tub full of water, but I'm not real sure.
I think you could probably get the job done that way.
And when he's talking about suicide, I don't think he's describing so much depression, but he's describing feeling rejected from the entire world and not having a place in it. He's probably spent a lot of his life feeling horrible. Horrible and judged and not appreciated and entitled and not getting attention or acknowledgement.
Basically, the reason I don't seriously contemplate getting rid of myself, I figured I'd have my heart attack before now, but hasn't happened. And I think I'm in fairly reasonably good health. I can't seem to find a job that I like. I'm basically alone in the world, except for the folks. I'm taking care of them. I'm not close with any of my siblings. Not real close. You look sadder than I do.
Him telling police that they look sadder than he does, I think actually shows some insight. It shows a little bit of awareness and willingness to say, yeah, I'm not motivated by the same things most people are. I thought I'd be dead by now. I'm still here. And he doesn't really want to continue to live. He doesn't get anything out of this life. Instead of getting busy living, he's waiting to die.
If I come over to your table, does that mean I'm innocent? Just a thought, since my lawyer ain't showed up yet. He's probably stuck in the elevator somewhere. Kind of reminds me of the Three Stooges. Sorry. Which one gets to be mom?
He is the center of attention. And for him, that's got to be satisfying, because this might be the most notoriety and meaning and attention he's gotten from other people. When we say that psychopaths are narcissistic and that everything has to be about them, what they're doing and focusing on is trying to prove to themselves and other people that they matter, that they're powerful, that they're important.
Tape her hands back up again. We'll sit her down on the van, leave her there. And I start listening for a heartbeat, but all I can hear is my heartbeat. It's just pounding, pounding. But Gina, dude, I love her. It's written on 24th Street Bridge. I love her, so I feel her.
Hey, Jeremiah. Feeling all right?
No.
What's wrong?
But I,
You need from running, so.
no, that's not from running.
Okay, what happened?
It's from dumping her body in Fremont. That's what his from. Mr. I generally record everything. Gina Wilcox is
Yeah.
Jeanna, dude.
How do you know her?
She's in Fremont. That's how I know her.
Is she in danger?
Can't help her no more.
The detectives, you almost hear their own shock in the interview. They're sitting down ready to investigate an auto theft, and he's just taken it to a place of harm to another human being and potentially murder. It's unbelievable to most of us that someone would come into a room, sit down, and just say, I dumped a body.
Nobody knows she's missing?
That's the part. They don't even know she's gone. Monday morning, Sunday night.
What do you mean by gone?
Like I ain't never getting out of here. And I just want to stop. I don't know.
Well, wait a minute, I gotta know if she's safe.
Connolly doesn't elaborate right away, and sometimes we call this the teasing effect that you'll see in people with psychopathy. They dangle some information, which we think is designed to get then a response from the viewer, sort of stun them, and we think that they derive some satisfaction from that.
Bunch of stuff's Columbus. That's right, fruit.
Oh, that's what you said. Why'd you throw her stuff in the alley?
Why'd I burn the van up the other day?
I don't know. I like thinking about a van. Tell me about that.
My 87 G20 van?
Yeah?
It had her in it, man. It had her in it. Had her in it.
What do you mean had her? You gave her a ride?
3 or 4 hours. Gave her a ride to Fremont. Dumped her in the ditch. I don't really care about that girl, dude.
Is she alive?
No, she's not.
He acknowledges that nobody even knew that this victim was missing, but then they know about it now because he's starting to disclose it, but also because after killing her, he stole a car and was driving erratically. So there's definitely some impulsivity, which is a feature that we see in psychopathy.
Tell me about Gina.
She's in Fremont. She's laying there in the road.
No,
Ain't
to get to
covered.
Fremont?
She's not covered up.
What's she wearing?
Duct tape.
That's it?
Yeah, I
Is she
remember.
naked?
That's the part that scared her, dude. To keep her from running. I got her naked. I told her I'm giving her step by step, like I'm some kind of weird teacher or prison coach. I was completely calm, completely cool. I said, this is to keep you running down the street, you know, to keep you thinking twice about running out of here.
He describes himself like a teacher or a coach, which is like he's putting himself on a pedestal, like he's better than the victim. And this is another element of that grandiosity, including even his comfort with calling the investigators dude. I think it takes a certain level of grandiosity to be able to do that in a situation like this. And is describing this in a way as if he's talking about something other than a kidnapping, a rape, and a murder.
That night in the laundromat, we were supposed to get high. And she's supposed to move in. I don't care.
She's your girlfriend?
I wasn't giving up the world for that girl, dude. She thought that she was not on my level. She thought my level was higher than hers, that I was too much of a prize for her, and I thought the same thing of her. And she wouldn't listen, man.
Oh, you think?
She wouldn't listen. She wanted to move back in with her roommate.
Okay.
But she, well, I'm going back. I never said I'd move in with you, you know. I never finalized it. at that laundromat.
For Connolly, for her to say, I don't want to move in with you, this isn't a relationship, or this isn't as serious as you think it is, likely was a massive rejection for him, and it challenged the fantasy that he had going in his head, that fixed delusion. And that may have been where there was an eruption of anger.
I changed it all dark. I wrapped duct tape, the biggest roll, black duct tape, backpack, stupid kidnapper kid. Not necessarily rape kid. Got in the van, drove over there, parked right in front of me, and snuck down to the laundromat on foot. I didn't want to be seen. I see her. Is she in the laundromat? Yeah, she was still there. I remember sitting across the street behind a tree, waiting, want to save her, you know? I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking when I ended her life. Right up behind her. Wanted to see how close I could get. I got a duct tape. I stand there and talk to her for a little while. Finally, I get done talking to her, and she puts her hand out like this. And I grab her hand, I'm up immediately aggressive. I'm juggling it, holding it. I say, get up, come on, let's go. And I get really, really primal. Really, you know, I'm like, get up, let's go. She's screaming and hollering. I'm looking around to see if anybody can hear it. Wrestled to the ground, got on top of her, tied her hands up with duct tape. Kept telling her, I tried to help you. You still wouldn't listen. You just didn't try.
He talks about how he wasn't aggressive at first, but then he goes primal. This speaks to his grandiosity and narcissism. He wants the power of being able to get as close to her as possible while he's sneaking up on her. And then ultimately, you know, confronting her.
He tried. I had the front or back, and her feet. Flipped her over. I keep, you know, threatening her and verbally aggressive, more teasing her so she knows, you know. Pick her up, throw her on my shoulder, and put her in the van.
He refers to teasing her, and it is sadistic. He knows that as he's already made up his mind that he's going to kill her.
What was she saying? Just like, you know, you're going to drop me off, right? I said, yeah, I'll drop you off eventually. I'm just lying to her. Just lying to her. And you'll be lucky if you go home tonight. She's like, you know, she starts up here and there. And she starts talking again. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Duct tape falls off. And I had given her a warning about that. And I said, you know, I said, did that tape just come off of your face? You know, and she said, no. You know, basically to maintain control of the situation, to stay as calm, as collective as I was just eerily calm. I'd love to be that calm all day long. If I could have grown up that calm and been raised that calm and that collected, I think my life would have been a lot better.
Here, Connolly saying to us is, I was calm, I was cool. My guess is he had fantasized for a while about being sadistic and coercive. And now that it was playing out, it was acting as a release for him. There was a buildup, and that's where he talks about he was calm and he was cool.
There is a bit of glibness and superficial charm that he's emanating, even though he may not seem charming. He has this superficiality to him, as if he's almost trying to get them engaged in the conversation, to lure them in with his details and the way he's describing what happened.
I got her naked, but she got scared I was going to rape her. And I'm like, dude, I'm not going to rape you, dude. It's going to keep you from running. Got her laid on the bed, and she kept looking back. Bed in your truck or your van? Conversion van, folds into a bench seat and a bed. Okay. And I started to undo my belt. I started to undo my pants, and she noticed. She's like, no. And she clenched real tight. She's like, no. You said you weren't going to do that. She's not trying to fight it. She's not squirming. She's sitting there. I didn't, like, rape her as in she's screaming like you see the episode of Law & Order SVU. She's not screaming. She's not fighting.
Connolly likely had some rape fantasies, and those somehow intersected with his fantasy or belief that he was in this relationship with the victim. He loves her, they're gonna live their lives together, but to harm her sexually challenges that reality, and that is where we see him dial back from that. And he's going out of his way to minimize the rape and sexual assault component of this.
I set her up. She's not crying. She's just looking at me, you know. And I told her something like that. I told her it wouldn't hurt you, you know. We're kind of sitting there. And I wait for about 30 seconds, 30, 45 seconds. I grab the fresh rolled duct tape up front. I slap it over her nose real quick, you know, as quick as I can. I said, I want to tell you a little story. When I grew up, I was drowned. It was the best way to go. If you're ever going to die, die of suffocation. As I made her a duct tape mask, that's what I was telling her.
What was your intention of doing that?
The quickest way possible. The most humane way. I told her, I said, dude, I got 100 different things in that Foot Locker back there, in the back of that van. 100 different tools I could use that are way more painful. You just understand that somebody gave about
Be suffocated or be scared about it.
That doesn't make sense.
Connolly talks about how he duct taped her face as if it was a humane act, and how that is a quick way to die, which is ironic because it really isn't. It's an incredibly tormented way for a human being to struggle and be harmed. And the fact that he duct taped her face makes me wonder if that was his attempt to distance himself and dehumanize her. So he didn't have to look at her eyes, he didn't have to look at her face, he didn't have to look at this woman that he had this romantic fantasy going.
I used my right hand and I choked her out. And I'm holding this on top of the duct tape, and you can tell her nose is pinched down as far as it can go. It's got to be a little bit, you know, but it's going to be quick. She fights and fights and fights. And finally, with my hand on her throat and the tape, it's just, she stops fighting him.
Connolly appears to be sniffing, sniveling, crying. The display of emotions seems very shallow or very out of proportion to the gravity of the situation. If someone came in to admit that they had murdered the love of their life and that they were remorseful about it, we'd expect to see more than this steady state of sniffing going through where he's sniveling and wiping his nose. But it's very superficial, very shallow.
So I tape her hands back up again. We'll sit her down on the van, lay her there, and I start listening for a heartbeat, listening for air. But all I can hear is my heartbeat. Every time I leaned up against her chest, all I could hear was my mind just pounding away. The calmness was gone. It was, the adrenaline was back. The calmness is over. Like a storm or something, you know, where it calms down at the end. But inside, this adrenaline's just pounding.
He talks about the adrenaline rush. He can hear his own heartbeat. This is really, it's really in that lane of what we call a very sadistic thrill form of killing. It's quite arousing to him.
With Gina, dude, I love her, dude. It's written on 24th Street Bridge. I love her, so I killed her. Through a neighborhood, quick as I can, because I'm drinking, and I'm thinking, it's just a dead body next to me. She's a corpse now, she's dead. She's laying on the floor between the chairs with her head like close so I can reach down. And I'm just driving through there so I don't get pulled over. I want to spend some time with her.
He knows she was dead. But then he also says, I wanted to spend some time with her. This was the optimal condition to be able to have a relationship experience with her because she's not going to fight back. She's not going to protest. You see that his value for human life is that they're objects. And that is very clearly that psychopathic trait that we see in individuals where there's no real value for human life.
Stumble over real quick, because I got somebody coming down the dirt road real quick. I throw her as far as I can swing her out to. I just left her there. I face down. You can see the hair. I guarantee you see it. It just became reckless. I tried to cover up evidence, but nobody would do it. Nobody knows she's missing. Nobody reported her missing. These are out here chasing me around in a stolen car. Can you even notice it was even missing? Hear more about material objects?
Connolly exemplifies failure to accept responsibility. This is a trait that we see in psychopathy where individuals will blame somebody or some event for their actions. So if only the police had noticed, like, why are they focused on this material object instead of a dead body? Why didn't anybody report her missing? I think it's also a product of his narcissism and the idea that he is, again, better than, smarter than, more capable than all of these people. The loved ones in her life, law enforcement, you name it.
Where am I going?
Well, sounds like we're gonna take you out to Fremont.
I can find it, dude. I'm just trying to do the right thing.
He's just totally disconnected to what he did. Connolly's clinical presentation isn't just about a fixed delusion. It isn't just about being a criminal. It's about being psychopathic. He is totally distanced himself and has no connection to the fact that that is a human being that he killed. You don't see any remorse. You don't see any feeling of guilt, a feeling of regret, a feeling of empathy for the fact that the victim is now dead.
Like right over here to the left, hit it with your, like this be a yard, bunch of toys. If we're on the right track, that's what it is. It's right past all that brush. They found it.
My intentions were mine, and I was hanging on to them because I could tell that they were negative. At the same time, I fall in love with this chick. Either way, whether the beast gets her or I get her, this is perfect. This one right here. Not beast, what I'm referring to. Just like, I don't know, the beast, you know, the hunger.
On January 29, 1958, the killing spree that had terrified Nebraska and Wyoming was approaching its final hours. Charles Raymond Starkweather, 19 years old, and 14-year-old Carol and Fugate were on the move, traveling through Wyoming in a stolen vehicle. Behind them was a trail of dead people stretching from Lincoln, Nebraska, into the countryside and across state lines. 11 people had been killed. Some had been members of Fugate's family. Others were strangers who had simply crossed Starkweather's path. By the end of that day, the police would finally catch the two young fugitives. But the arrest would not answer the question that would remain at the center of the case for decades. What had Carol Fugate actually done? Starkweather would later insist that she had participated in the killings. Fugate would tell a completely different story. She said that Starkweather had taken control of her life through threats and fear, and that she had been held as a hostage. The disagreement was not a minor detail. It would become one of the defining mysteries of the entire case. To understand why, it is necessary to look at what had happened during the days before the arrest, and at the young man whose name had become synonymous with one of the most notorious killing sprees in 20th century America. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska. When the killings occurred, he was only 19 years old. He had grown up in a working-class family and had held a number of manual labor jobs, including work collecting garbage. Historical accounts of Starkweather often describe him as hot-tempered and deeply attracted to images of rebellion that were becoming increasingly visible in American popular culture. He was also associated with feelings of resentment and with the belief that society looked down on him. Those elements have often been discussed when examining his life, but they must be treated carefully. Poverty, frustration, anger, social rejection, or dissatisfaction do not provide a simple explanation for murder. Millions of people experience hardship and resentment without becoming violent criminals. Whatever circumstances surrounded Starkweather's early life, they cannot be used as a direct explanation for the 11 deaths that followed. In 1956, Starkweather began a relationship with Carol and Fugate. She was approximately 14 years old. Starkweather was 18. Their relationship would eventually become inseparable from the story of the killings, because Fugate was not simply present at the end of the spree. She was at the center of the argument over what happened inside her own family's home and what happened afterward. The first known murder attributed to Starkweather occurred before the January killings. In late November 1957, or on December 1st according to some accounts, Starkweather killed Robert William Calvert, a 21-year-old employee at a gas station in Lincoln. The precise date is recorded differently in historical sources, but Nebraska historical records identify Calvert as Starkweather's first victim. According to Starkweather's later account, he became involved in a confrontation with Calvert at the station. He left, then returned carrying a gun. Calvert was shot and killed, and Starkweather took money from the gas station before leaving. What happened afterward is important because the killing of Calvert did not immediately become the beginning of a continuous series of murders. Starkweather continued living for several weeks. The concentrated period of violence came later, in January 1958. That distinction is one reason the term spree killing is often more appropriate than treating the entire period as a conventional, uninterrupted serial murder sequence. The first killing was separated from the January bloodshed by several weeks. Then, on January 21st, everything changed. Starkweather went to the Fugate home in Lincoln. Inside the house were three people: Velda Bartlett Fugate, Carol's mother, Marion Bartlett, Carol's stepfather, and Betty Jean Bartlett, Carol's approximately 2-year-old half-sister. All three would be killed that day. Marion and Velda were shot. Betty Jean was also murdered. Starkweather then concealed the victims around the property. But there was one person whose presence or absence would become just as important as the bodies themselves: Carol Fugate. Where was she? What did she know? And when did she learn what had happened to her family? Starkweather and Fugate would eventually give sharply conflicting answers. Starkweather claimed that Fugate knew what was happening and participated in the violence. He later made accusations that she had taken an active role in some of the killings, including allegations involving a gun and a knife. Fugate denied this. Her account was that when she returned to the house, Starkweather had control of the situation. She said he told her that her family was being held hostage and threatened to kill her if she resisted. According to her version, she was forced to comply because she believed that opposing him could cost her own life. The distinction between those two stories would eventually determine much of the public and legal discussion surrounding Fugate. For several days after the deaths, Starkweather and Fugate remained at the property. A notice was placed in an effort to make outsiders believe that the family was ill. Meanwhile, the bodies of the victims remained concealed around the home. From the outside, the house was being made to appear occupied by a family that was simply not available to visitors. But relatives and neighbors began to become suspicious. The family was not being seen. Something was wrong. Eventually, authorities were contacted. When law enforcement inspected the property, Starkweather and Fugate were already gone. What investigators encountered transformed the case from a disturbing local mystery into the beginning of a major manhunt. 3 people from the Fugate household were dead. Starkweather was missing. Carol Fugate was missing, and nobody yet knew whether the killings were finished. The uncertainty was perhaps the most frightening part. If Starkweather had already killed once before, and now 3 more people were dead, there was no way for the public to know where the violence might end. Police began searching for the pair. The story spread rapidly, and the growing importance of television meant that this was not a crime story confined to local newspapers. The pursuit became a national event. Images and reports of Starkweather circulated beyond Nebraska, while residents in the surrounding region faced the knowledge that an armed killer remained at large. But the next stage of the spree would reveal something even more disturbing. The victims would no longer be limited to people connected to Carol Fugate. Starkweather's violence would begin reaching people who had never known him, people whose only apparent connection to him was that they happened to cross his path. The family home in Lincoln had been the beginning of the January killings. It would not be the end. Over the next several days, the trail would move through Nebraska, claim more lives, cross into Wyoming, and finally lead police to Douglas, where the search for Starkweather and Fugate would come to an end. Yet before that final confrontation, 7 more people would die. And among them would be people who had made one simple decision that seemed harmless at the time: to stop and help a stranger. By January 21st, 1958, Charles Starkweather had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The killing of Robert Calvert in late November had been followed by several weeks in which there was no continuous series of murders. But whatever separation existed between that first killing and what came next would soon disappear. On January 21st, Starkweather arrived at the Fugate home in Lincoln, Nebraska. Inside the house were 3 members of Carol Fugate's family: her mother, Velda Bartlett Fugate, her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, and her approximately 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean Bartlett. By the end of that day, all 3 would be dead. Their deaths marked the beginning of the concentrated killing spree that would claim 11 lives in Nebraska and Wyoming within a matter of days. Velda and Marion were shot. Betty Jean was also killed. Starkweather then concealed the victims around the property. The scene would later become one of the most important points in the investigation, not only because 3 people had been murdered, but because of the unanswered question surrounding the 4th member of the household. Carol Fugate was 14 years old, and her account of what happened inside that house would eventually stand in direct opposition to Starkweather's. The question was not simply whether she knew that her family had been killed. The deeper question was whether she had participated willingly, or whether Starkweather had forced her into silence through threats and fear. That question would follow her for the rest of her life. Starkweather's version was damaging to Fugate. After his arrest, he accused her of knowing about and participating in the killings. His later statements included allegations that she had taken part in violence against some victims and had used both a firearm and a knife. Fugate rejected those claims. Her story was that Starkweather had taken control of the situation and threatened her. She said that when she returned to the house, he told her that her family was being held hostage. According to her account, he threatened to kill her if she resisted him. She therefore maintained that she had been acting under coercion rather than as a willing participant. These 2 accounts would become the central contradiction of the case. There was no simple way to resolve the dispute merely by listening to the 2 people involved. Starkweather had already admitted responsibility for killing people, and he had an obvious interest in explaining his own actions and in describing Fugate's role. Fugate, meanwhile, had every reason to deny responsibility for the deaths of her family and for the killings that followed. The truth would have to be examined through the circumstances surrounding the murders, the statements made after the arrests, and ultimately through the courts. But before any courtroom could consider those questions, the killings continued. For several days after the deaths at the Fugate home, Starkweather and Fugate remained at the property. A notice was placed to create the impression that the family was sick. To anyone outside the house, the absence of the Fugate family could therefore appear less alarming than it really was. But behind that appearance, 3 people were dead. Their bodies remained concealed around the property, while Starkweather and Fugate stayed there. Eventually, the silence surrounding the house became impossible to ignore. Relatives and neighbors grew suspicious because they were not seeing the family. Something about the situation did not make sense. Authorities were eventually notified. When law enforcement went to investigate, Starkweather and Fugate had already left. What investigators discovered transformed the case. The disappearance of one family had become a murder investigation, and Starkweather was no longer simply a suspect connected to the earlier death of Robert Calvert. He was now connected to 3 additional killings. More importantly, he was gone. Carol Fugate was gone with him. At that moment, investigators did not know how far the violence would spread. They did not know how many victims there might eventually be. And they did not know whether Starkweather intended to continue killing. The uncertainty created the conditions for a rapidly expanding manhunt. Lincoln and the surrounding region were confronted with the knowledge that a 19-year-old armed killer was somewhere beyond the reach of police. The fact that Fugate was only 14 added another disturbing dimension. Was she traveling with Starkweather because she wanted to? Was she helping him? Or was she being held under threat, as she would later claim? These questions could not immediately be answered. What was known was that the pair had left the Fugate property and were moving. The case was beginning to expand beyond a single home in Lincoln. The next phase would take them into other parts of Nebraska, where the victims would no longer all have a direct connection to Fugate's family. On January 27th, Starkweather and Fugate reached the area around Bennett, Nebraska. There they encountered August Meyer, an older man. Meyer was killed by Starkweather. His death represented an important change in the pattern of the violence. The killings had begun with people connected to the Fugate household. Now another person had been drawn into the spree. There was no established family connection between Meyer and the earlier victims in the information available here. He was simply another person encountered as Starkweather and Fugate moved through Nebraska. The next victims would make that change even more striking. Starkweather and Fugate became involved in a situation in which their vehicle was stuck. Robert Jensen and Carol King, a young couple, came upon them. They stopped to help. That decision would cost them their lives. Jensen and King had no known reason to expect violence. They were not described as enemies of Starkweather. They were not members of Fugate's family. They were strangers who stopped when they saw people needing assistance. Starkweather subsequently killed both of them. Jensen was shot, and King was also murdered. Their deaths became some of the most disturbing moments in the entire spree because they demonstrated how completely the boundary between personal conflict and random victimization had begun to disappear. The first known murder had followed a confrontation at a gas station. The killings at the Fugate home had involved people connected to Starkweather's relationship with Carol. But Jensen and King were different. They had simply stopped. After the murders, Starkweather and Fugate used Jensen's vehicle to continue their movements and eventually returned toward Lincoln. By now, the killing spree was moving with extraordinary speed. In just a few days, the number of victims had risen dramatically. Investigators were dealing with a suspect who was mobile, armed, and apparently willing to kill people who had no meaningful connection to him. The geography of the case was also expanding. What had begun in Lincoln was moving outward across Nebraska. The authorities had to confront not only the murders already committed, but the possibility that Starkweather could encounter more people and kill again. And he would. On January 28th, Starkweather and Fugate returned to Lincoln. Their next destination was the home of C. Lauer and Clara Ward. Also present was Lillian Finkel, a servant employed by the household. All three were killed. The murders added 3 more names to an already growing list of victims: C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel. Starkweather then took the Ward family's Packard. The vehicle provided the means for the pair to leave Nebraska once again. At this point, the killing spree had become a moving chain of violence. A gas station employee, members of Fugate's family, an older man, a young couple who had stopped to help, a household in Lincoln. The identities of the victims were becoming increasingly varied, while the time between killings was becoming increasingly short. Starkweather and Fugate were no longer simply trying to conceal what had happened at the Fugate home. They were moving from place to place, leaving more victims behind them. The Packard carried them westward, toward Wyoming. Behind them was a widening trail of deaths. Ahead of them was the final day of the spree. On January 29th, they would encounter Merle Collison near Douglas, Wyoming. Collison would become the 11th and final victim. But before that final encounter, Starkweather and Fugate had already transformed what might once have been understood as a single murder into one of the most notorious killing sprees in American history. And the question of what Carol Fugate had truly been during those days, accomplice, witness, or hostage, was only beginning to take shape. By the time authorities discovered what had happened inside the Fugate home, Charles Starkweather and Carol and Fugate were already gone. 3 people were dead: Velda Bartlett Fugate, Marion Bartlett, and 2-year-old Betty Jean Bartlett. The house had been made to appear as though the family was simply ill and unable to receive visitors. But the apparent illness concealed a much darker reality. The bodies of the victims remained hidden around the property, while the 2 young people at the center of the case had disappeared. This was the point at which the investigation changed completely. Before January 21st, Starkweather had been connected to the killing of Robert Calvert, a 21-year-old gas station employee murdered in Lincoln in late November 1957. Now there were 3 additional deaths, and the person investigators believed responsible was no longer where they could find him. Even more troubling was the presence of Carol Fugate. She was only 14 years old, and she had disappeared alongside Starkweather. Investigators therefore had to confront 2 questions at the same time. Where were Starkweather and Fugate, and what had happened to Carol's family? The answers would not come from the fugitives themselves at first. They would emerge from the property, from the discovery of the victims, and later from the conflicting statements Starkweather and Fugate would give after their capture. The circumstances surrounding the house also became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. For several days, Starkweather and Fugate had remained there after the killings. The notice placed outside was intended to make people believe that the family was sick. It created an appearance of normality where there was none. The family was not simply absent. They had been murdered. The deception could only last for so long. Relatives and neighbors became suspicious because the Fugate family was not being seen. Eventually, authorities were contacted. When law enforcement investigated the property, the reality became clear. The house was no longer simply the home of a missing family. It was a crime scene. 3 members of that family were dead, and the people who might have known exactly what had happened were gone. The disappearance of Starkweather and Fugate immediately turned the investigation into a search. Police needed to determine where the pair had gone and whether other people were in danger. At that moment, nobody could know that the killings would soon extend beyond the Fugate family and eventually cross state lines. Starkweather had already demonstrated that he was willing to kill. The murder of Robert Calvert had established that months earlier. The deaths at the Fugate home showed that the violence had now escalated dramatically. But the next victims would reveal an even more dangerous development. People who had no obvious connection to Starkweather would also become targets. The manhunt began against that uncertain background. Lincoln and the surrounding region were suddenly confronted with a young armed suspect who was believed to have killed several people and who was no longer at the scene. The possibility that he could continue moving and continue killing was now a reality. The case also attracted enormous attention because of the growing influence of television. America in the late 1950s was becoming increasingly accustomed to seeing major events reported not only in newspapers but also through television broadcasts. The Starkweather pursuit, therefore, became more than a local Nebraska investigation. Reports of the killings and the search for the fugitives spread beyond the immediate area. The story became one of the most closely watched criminal cases of its time. Yet the public did not know what was happening inside the minds of the two people being sought. Starkweather's motives remained unclear. Fugate's role remained disputed. And the number of victims was still growing. On January 27th, Starkweather and Fugate were in the area of Bennett, Nebraska. There they encountered August Meyer, an older man. Meyer was killed by Starkweather. His death was significant because the pattern of the killings was changing. The first known victim, Robert Calvert, had been involved in a confrontation with Starkweather at a gas station. The three victims at the Fugate home were members of Carroll's family. Meyer did not fit either pattern. He was another person encountered as the fugitives moved through Nebraska. The killing demonstrated that the danger was no longer confined to the people closest to Starkweather and Fugate. Anyone who crossed their path could potentially become a victim. The next encounter made that reality even more tragic. Starkweather and Fugate became involved in a situation in which their vehicle was stuck. Robert Jensen and Carol King, a young couple, came upon them. They stopped to help. There is something especially difficult about that moment because the available account gives no indication that Jensen and King had any reason to expect violence. They were not described as people who had been pursuing Starkweather. They were not connected to the Fugate family. They were simply a young couple who stopped when they encountered people who appeared to need assistance. Instead of finding an ordinary roadside problem, they encountered a killer. Starkweather killed both of them. Jensen was shot, and King was also murdered. Their deaths became an important point in understanding how far the spree had escalated. The violence was no longer restricted to disputes, family tensions, or people with some previous relationship to the killer. The victims could now be strangers. After Jensen and King were killed, Starkweather and Fugate used Jensen's vehicle to continue their journey. The pair eventually returned toward Lincoln. The movement itself was significant. Starkweather was not remaining in one location, and the changing vehicles made it more difficult for authorities to predict where he would go next. At the same time, every new location created the possibility of another encounter. The number of dead was rising, but the killings were happening so quickly that investigators were forced to reconstruct events almost as they unfolded. By January 28th, Starkweather and Fugate were back in Lincoln. They went to the home of C. Lauer and Clara Ward. Lillian Finkel, a servant employed by the household, was also there. All three were killed. Their deaths brought the number of victims in the January spree still higher. Starkweather then took the Ward family's Packard. Once again, the vehicle became part of the movement of the fugitives. The Packard allowed Starkweather and Fugate to leave Nebraska and head west toward Wyoming. Behind them, investigators were piecing together a rapidly expanding series of murders. Ahead of them was another victim and another vehicle. The public fear surrounding the case grew because there was no obvious way to know where the fugitives would appear next. The victims had become increasingly disconnected from one another. A gas station employee, a family in Lincoln, an older man near Bennett, a young couple who stopped to help, a household in Lincoln. The pattern was no longer one of a killer pursuing a clearly defined group. It was a moving spree. The violence itself had become the common link between people who otherwise had nothing in common. By the end of January 28th, Starkweather and Fugate were heading toward Wyoming. The authorities were searching for them, but the pair remained free. The story had already become a major national news event, amplified by television coverage and the fear generated by an armed killer moving across state lines. Then, on January 29th, the journey brought them near Douglas, Wyoming. There they encountered a Buick parked by the road. Inside was Merle Collison, a traveling salesman who was asleep in the vehicle. Collison had no known connection to the earlier victims. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Starkweather approached the Buick, and Collison was killed. The 11th victim had been added to the list. Starkweather then took the Buick and attempted to leave the area. But this time, the circumstances would be different. An unusual situation attracted the attention of a witness, and police were notified. The authorities now had an opportunity to intercept the fugitives. Starkweather and Fugate drove into the Douglas area, where police identified the vehicle. A pursuit followed. Starkweather attempted to escape, but the chase eventually led to a confrontation involving gunfire. The manhunt that had begun after the discovery of the Fugate family murders was finally reaching its conclusion. Starkweather was captured. Fugate was captured with him. The pursuit was over. But the investigation was only beginning. 11 people were dead, and authorities now had the 2 people who might explain how those deaths had occurred. Yet instead of producing a single, straightforward account, the arrests opened a new conflict. Starkweather would make statements accusing Fugate of active participation. Fugate would maintain that she had been threatened and controlled. Those competing stories would become central to the investigation, the trials, and the question that would remain long after Starkweather himself was executed. Was Carol Fugate a willing participant in the murders? Or had she become another victim of the violence surrounding her? By January 27, 1958, the search for Charles Starkweather and Carol and Fugate had become a race against time. The discovery of the Fugate family murders had revealed the terrible reality left behind in Lincoln. But investigators still did not know where the 2 fugitives had gone. They also could not know that the violence was about to move beyond the immediate circle of Carol's family. The next victims would be people with no established connection to the Fugate household, and the killings would unfold with increasing speed. Starkweather and Fugate were moving through Nebraska, changing vehicles and locations as they attempted to remain out of reach. At this stage, the spree was no longer simply a family tragedy hidden inside one house. It had become a mobile threat. On January 27th, Starkweather and Fugate reached the area around Bennett, Nebraska. There they encountered August Meyer, an older man. Meyer was killed by Starkweather. His death added another name to an already growing list, but its significance went beyond the number itself. Until this point, the most important victims had been people connected in some way to Starkweather's immediate circumstances. Robert Calvert had been killed after a confrontation at a gas station. Velda Bartlett Fugate, Marion Bartlett, and Betty Jean Bartlett were members of Carol Fugate's family. Meyer represented a further expansion of the violence. He was encountered during the fugitives' movements through Nebraska, and he became a victim. There was no established personal connection between him and the earlier victims in the information available about the case. The boundaries of the spree were becoming harder to define. Anyone encountered along the route could potentially be drawn into the violence. That danger became even clearer when Starkweather and Fugate encountered Robert Jensen and Carol King. Their meeting began with something ordinary. Starkweather and Fugate were dealing with a vehicle that had become stuck, and Jensen and King stopped to help. They were a young couple who had no reason to expect that a simple act of assistance could place them in danger. They were not police officers searching for Starkweather. They were not relatives of the Fugate family. They were not described as having any previous conflict with him. They were simply people who stopped, yet their decision to help would end in their deaths. Starkweather killed Robert Jensen and Carol King. Jensen was shot, and King was also murdered. The tragedy of their deaths lies partly in how ordinary the initial encounter was. A stranded vehicle can appear to be an everyday roadside problem. Someone stops. A brief conversation takes place. Help is offered. But in this case, the situation concealed a much greater danger. For Jensen and King, there was no opportunity to understand the larger circumstances before they became victims. Their deaths also demonstrated how far Starkweather's violence had progressed. The killings were no longer restricted to people connected to a personal dispute. The victims could now be strangers. After Jensen and King were killed, Starkweather and Fugate used Jensen's vehicle to continue moving. The stolen vehicle became another part of the rapidly changing trail investigators would later have to reconstruct. Every change in location created another challenge for law enforcement. Starkweather was mobile, and the police were trying to follow a trail that was expanding across Nebraska. The fugitives eventually returned toward Lincoln. By January 28th, the killing spree had entered another stage. Starkweather and Fugate went to the home of C. Lauer and Clara Ward. Lillian Finkel, a servant employed by the household, was also present. All three were killed. Their deaths brought 3 more victims into the case in a single location. C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel had now become part of a chain that had begun with one gas station employee and had expanded through a family tragedy, a roadside encounter, and another household. The growing number of victims made the case increasingly difficult to comprehend. There was no single category that explained everyone who had died. They were connected only by the fact that Starkweather had encountered them. After the killings at the Ward residence, Starkweather took the family's Packard. The vehicle would allow the fugitives to leave Lincoln and head toward Wyoming. The significance of that departure was clear. The investigation was no longer confined to Nebraska. Starkweather was carrying the consequences of the killings with him as he moved west. The Packard represented another attempt to stay ahead of the search, but it also created a traceable connection between the fugitives and the crimes. At the same time, the public was becoming increasingly aware of the danger. The case had already attracted widespread attention, and the developing role of television meant that the pursuit was being followed far beyond the communities where the murders had occurred. The image of a 19-year-old killer moving through the Great Plains, accompanied by a 14-year-old girl, captured national attention. But the public story could not capture the full uncertainty surrounding Fugate. Was she helping Starkweather, or was she being forced to remain with him? The answer was not yet known. Even after the pair were captured, the dispute would continue. For the moment, however, the immediate concern was the possibility of more violence. Starkweather had killed again and again. Each new victim demonstrated that the danger had not diminished. The murders of Jensen and King had shown that even strangers who stopped to help could become targets. The killings of Lauer, Ward, and Finkel showed that another household could be swept into the violence. And now Starkweather and Fugate were leaving Nebraska. Their destination was Wyoming. On January 29th, they reached the area near Douglas. By this point, the killing spree had already claimed 10 lives. One more death would bring the total to 11. That final victim was Merle Collison, a traveling salesman. Collison was sleeping inside a Buick when Starkweather and Fugate encountered him. There was no known personal connection between Collison and the earlier victims. Like Jensen and King, he was essentially a stranger whose path crossed that of Starkweather. The circumstances of his death would bring the spree to its final stage. Starkweather approached the vehicle, and Collison was killed. Starkweather then took the Buick and attempted to leave the area. But the situation surrounding the Buick drew attention. A witness noticed something suspicious, and authorities were alerted. For the first time in the Wyoming phase of the journey, the fugitives were no longer moving unnoticed. Police were now closing in. Starkweather and Fugate drove into the Douglas area, where officers identified the vehicle. A pursuit followed. Starkweather attempted to escape, but the chase eventually led to an armed confrontation. The manhunt that had begun in Nebraska after the discovery of the Fugate family murders was finally reaching its end. Starkweather was captured. Fugate was captured as well. The two people at the center of the investigation were finally in police custody. But the arrest did not provide a simple explanation for what had happened. Instead, it opened a second phase of the case: the reconstruction of the killings and the attempt to determine responsibility. Investigators now had 11 victims to account for, a sequence of rapidly changing locations, multiple stolen vehicles, and two suspects whose accounts would eventually conflict. Starkweather would admit responsibility for the killings, but would also make accusations against Fugate. Fugate would deny being a willing participant and maintain that she had been threatened and controlled. The final victim, Merle Collison, had died in Wyoming. The previous victims had been killed across Nebraska. The geographic trail now existed as a grim sequence: Lincoln, Bennett, other locations across Nebraska, and finally Douglas. But the meaning of that trail would be debated long after the police pursuit ended. The victims could be counted 11 in all, but counting them did not explain the violence. The investigation would have to look beyond the number and reconstruct what had happened to each person. It would also have to confront the most difficult question of all: whether Carol Fugate had been a participant in the killings or another person trapped inside Starkweather's escalating violence. The answers would begin to emerge through Starkweather's statements after his arrest. Those statements, recorded in extensive detail, would become some of the most important material in the investigation. But they would also make the case more complicated, because Starkweather was not simply describing what he had done. He was describing what he claimed Carol had done as well. And that accusation would become the foundation of one of the most enduring controversies in the entire Starkweather case. When Charles Starkweather and Carol and Fugate were finally taken into custody in Douglas, Wyoming, the physical manhunt was over. But for investigators, the more difficult work was only beginning. 11 people were dead, their deaths spread across Nebraska and Wyoming, and the two people who had traveled together through the final days of the killing spree were now available for questioning. Yet the arrest did not produce a single, unified explanation. Instead, they opened a conflict between two accounts that would remain central to the case for decades. Starkweather admitted responsibility for the killings, but he also accused Fugate of participating in them. Fugate denied that she had been a willing accomplice. She maintained that Starkweather had controlled her through threats and fear, and that she had been forced to remain with him. The investigators therefore faced a complicated task. They had to reconstruct what had happened to 11 victims while also determining how much weight could be placed on the statements of two young people whose interests were fundamentally opposed. Starkweather was 19. Fugate was 14. Their ages alone made the case extraordinary, but age did not answer the question of responsibility. The authorities needed facts, timelines, statements, and whatever evidence could be recovered from the places where the murders had occurred. Starkweather's own words became particularly important. After his arrest, he provided detailed statements to investigators and prosecutors. The surviving historical records include extensive transcripts of these interrogations. On February 1, 1958, Starkweather gave statements to County Attorney Elmer M. Shealy. The records from those sessions totaled 192 pages. Later, on February 27th, he provided another statement that ran to 164 pages. These documents became an important part of the historical record because they preserved Starkweather's descriptions of the events after the arrests. But the existence of extensive statements did not make the case simple. A statement is not automatically the same thing as an objective account. Starkweather was describing events in which he himself had participated, and his statements included accusations against Fugate. Investigators, therefore, had to consider not only what he said, but also the circumstances and possible motivations behind his claims. His version of Fugate's role was direct and damaging. Starkweather insisted that she had known what was happening and had actively participated in some of the violence. According to the accusations preserved in the Nebraska records, he claimed that she had taken part in several killings and had used weapons. including a gun and a knife. If those allegations were true, Fugate was not merely present during the spree. She was an active participant, but Fugate told a different story. She said Starkweather had threatened her and that she had been forced to comply with him. Her explanation focused on the circumstances inside the Fugate home. She maintained that when she became aware of what Starkweather had done, he told her that her family was being held hostage and threatened to kill her if she resisted. Under that account, her continued presence with Starkweather was not evidence of cooperation. It was evidence of coercion. The difference between the two stories was enormous. One presented Fugate as an accomplice. The other presented her as another victim. The eventual legal proceedings would have to determine which interpretation was supported by the evidence. But before that question could be resolved, investigators had to understand the entire sequence of events. The first known killing was Robert Calvert, murdered at a Lincoln gas station in late November 1957. Starkweather admitted responsibility for that death. Weeks later came the three murders at the Fugate residence: Velda Bartlett Fugate, Marion Bartlett, and Betty Jean Bartlett. Then came August Meyer near Bennett. Robert Jensen and Carol King were killed after stopping to help when Starkweather and Fugate's vehicle was stuck. The killings continued with C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel in Lincoln. Finally, in Wyoming, Merle Collison became the 11th victim. The sequence was remarkable not only because of its length, but because of how quickly the killings accumulated during the final days. The investigation, therefore, had to connect individual crimes that occurred in different places and under different circumstances. It also had to determine what happened to the vehicles taken during the spree. Starkweather and Fugate had used Jensen's vehicle after his death. Later, Starkweather took the Packard belonging to the Ward family. In Wyoming, he took the Buick in which Merle Collison had been found. The changing vehicles were part of the movement of the fugitives and helped establish the geographic progression of the case. The investigation was gradually transforming the killings from a series of frightening reports into a chronological trail. Yet the question of Fugate remained unresolved. One of the most difficult aspects of the case was the fact that she was not an adult. She was 14 years old when the murders occurred. Her age made the allegation that she had voluntarily participated particularly consequential. If she had been acting under threats from a 19-year-old armed killer, then her conduct would have to be understood through the possibility of coercion. If she had willingly helped Starkweather, however, the legal consequences would be very different. The authorities could not simply assume either version. They had to examine the circumstances surrounding her presence at each stage of the spree. The controversy was also complicated by the fact that Starkweather himself had a reason to shift responsibility. His accusations against Fugate potentially changed the way his own actions could be understood. At the same time, Fugate had an obvious reason to deny participation. Neither statement could be accepted simply because it came from one of the two people involved. That conflict would eventually become one of the defining features of the trials. Starkweather's psychological state also became an issue as the case moved toward court. The defense would argue that he had mental problems affecting his ability to understand and control his actions. The prosecution, however, would point toward the sequence of his conduct. He moved between locations, changed vehicles, attempted to avoid capture, and continued to kill over a period of days. These actions became important in a legal argument over whether he had the capacity to form the intent required for the most serious murder charge. The investigation therefore moved on two parallel tracks. One track was factual and chronological: who had been killed, where, when, and how the fugitives had moved from one place to another. The other was psychological and legal: what had Starkweather understood, what had he intended, and what role had Fugate played? The answers would ultimately be decided in court. For the moment, however, investigators were dealing with a case whose scale had become impossible to ignore. 11 people had lost their lives. Their ages, occupations, and circumstances varied, but they were united by the fact that Starkweather had encountered them during the spree. Some had been members of Fugate's family. Others were strangers. Some had been inside their own homes. Others had been on the road. One had been sleeping in a vehicle in Wyoming. The victims did not form a single group, and there was no single event that explained all 11 deaths. What connected them was the expanding violence of one 19-year-old man. After the arrests, the story therefore shifted from pursuit to accountability. Starkweather was no longer an unknown figure moving across the Great Plains. He was a defendant whose actions would be examined in court. Fugate was no longer simply the girl found beside him at the end of the chase. She would become a defendant in her own right, with her own version of events. The extensive statements Starkweather had given would be examined. His accusations against Fugate would become part of the controversy, and the question of his mental state would become central to his defense. The next stage of the case would take the investigation into the courtroom, where the question would no longer be simply where Starkweather had gone or how many people he had killed. It would be whether the law considered his actions deliberate and punishable by death, and whether Carol Fugate had been a participant in those crimes or, as she maintained, a 14-year-old girl who had been forced into the nightmare by the man beside her. After the arrests in Wyoming, the investigation no longer depended on the police finding Starkweather. They had him. The immediate danger of the killing spree had ended, but the legal questions surrounding the 11 deaths were only beginning. Investigators and prosecutors now had to transform a rapidly unfolding series of murders into a case that could be presented in court. At the center of that process was Charles Starkweather himself. He had admitted responsibility for the killings, but his statements also contained accusations against Carol and Fugate. At the same time, the defense would challenge whether Starkweather possessed the mental capacity necessary to be held fully responsible for his actions. The coming trial would therefore examine not only what Starkweather had done, but what he had understood when he did it. The most important charge in his Nebraska prosecution concerned the death of Robert Jensen. Starkweather was charged with murder in connection with Jensen's killing, including an allegation that the killing had been committed deliberately and in connection with a robbery. Starkweather pleaded not guilty. His defense centered in part on his mental condition and his ability to form the required intent. This issue was crucial because Nebraska law distinguished between a killing that was intentional and calculated and one in which the defendant could not be held responsible in the same way because of severe mental impairment. Starkweather's lawyers therefore sought to present the argument that his mental state affected his ability to understand or control his conduct. The prosecution took the opposite position. The state's case emphasized the sequence of events surrounding the spree. Starkweather had not committed one isolated act and then immediately stopped. The killings had unfolded across different locations. He had moved from place to place. He had used different vehicles. He had taken property from victims. He had continued traveling after earlier murders. And after the deaths in Nebraska, he had crossed into Wyoming, where Merle Collison became the 11th and final victim. For the prosecution, these actions were significant because they suggested awareness and purposeful behavior. The argument was not simply that Starkweather had been violent. It was that the pattern of his conduct demonstrated that he understood what he was doing and was capable of making decisions during the spree. The distinction mattered. A person can commit an extremely violent act and still raise a legal question about mental responsibility. The court therefore had to consider more than the horrifying outcome of the crimes. It had to examine whether Starkweather possessed the mental capacity required for criminal responsibility under the law. The evidence and testimony surrounding this issue became an important part of the trial. Starkweather's own conduct after the murders also mattered. He had moved between locations, used vehicles belonging to victims, and attempted to evade capture. After killing Merle Collison near Douglas, Wyoming, he attempted to leave in Collison's Buick. The resulting pursuit ended with his arrest. These actions provided prosecutors with a sequence that could be presented as evidence of awareness, rather than complete inability to understand reality. The state could point to the fact that Starkweather was capable of moving from one location to another and responding to circumstances as they changed. The defense, however, sought to place those actions within the context of Starkweather's mental state. The question was not whether he could physically move, drive, or attempt to escape. The question was whether his psychological condition prevented him from forming the specific criminal intent required for the charge. This was one of the most difficult issues surrounding the case. Starkweather was only 19. He had already become the central figure in one of the most shocking killing sprees in Nebraska history. Yet his age and psychological condition became relevant to the legal proceedings. The court was being asked to determine responsibility, not merely to describe behavior. While the prosecution focused on the evidence connecting Starkweather to the murders, the defense sought to complicate the picture by emphasizing his mental condition. The trial, therefore, became a confrontation between two interpretations of the same events. One interpretation saw a young man who had deliberately killed and then repeatedly continued killing, while attempting to move away from law enforcement. The other sought to show that his mental state interfered with the level of intention necessary for the most severe criminal responsibility. Throughout the proceedings, the victims remained at the center of what had happened, even though the legal argument necessarily focused heavily on the defendant. Robert Jensen had been killed after stopping to help. Carole King had died in the same encounter. August Meyer had been killed in Nebraska. The three members of the Fugate family had died inside the home where Carole had lived. C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel had been killed at the Ward residence. Merle Collison had been killed in Wyoming while sleeping in his vehicle. Robert Calvert, the first known victim, had died at a Lincoln gas station weeks earlier. Their deaths were not merely pieces of evidence. They were 11 individual lives ended during a period of escalating violence. The prosecution's task was to establish Starkweather's responsibility within that sequence. His own statements were especially important because he had acknowledged responsibility for the murders. Yet those statements also created another problem. Starkweather did not simply describe himself as the sole actor. He accused Fugate of participating in some of the violence. That accusation would become a major issue in the separate case against her. Starkweather's statements, therefore, had consequences beyond his own trial. They potentially influenced how investigators, prosecutors, and the public understood the 14-year-old girl who had been captured alongside him. The legal system would have to decide whether his claims about Fugate were credible and supported by the available evidence. For Starkweather himself, however, the immediate question was the punishment he faced. A conviction for first-degree murder could result in the death penalty. The prosecution sought to establish that the killing of Jensen met the legal standard for the most serious form of murder. Starkweather's defense attempted to prevent that outcome by challenging his mental responsibility. The jury ultimately rejected the defense to the extent necessary to convict him. Starkweather was found guilty of first-degree murder in the Jensen case and convicted under the robbery-related charge as well. The result was a sentence of death. The decision reflected the jury's conclusion that the prosecution had established the necessary criminal responsibility and that the evidence supported the most severe punishment available. But the case was not yet finished. A death sentence in Nebraska was subject to further legal review, and Starkweather's attorneys pursued an appeal. The Nebraska Supreme Court examined the case and, on December 19, 1958, upheld the conviction and sentence. The ruling left Starkweather facing execution. By then, nearly a year had passed since the killing of Robert Calvert and less than a year since the concentrated January spree had ended. The case that had begun with a local killing at a Lincoln gas station had become a national story. A major criminal prosecution, and a continuing debate about mental responsibility and the role of Carole Fugate. Yet the legal process surrounding Fugate had not followed exactly the same path as Starkweather's. She would face her own trial and her own punishment. Her defense depended heavily on the claim that she had not freely participated in the killings. Unlike Starkweather, who had admitted to killing the victims, Fugate maintained that she had been forced into remaining with him. Her age was central to the argument. She had been 14 during the murders. Her claim was that Starkweather had threatened her and that she had obeyed because she feared he would kill her. Prosecutors, however, treated her as an active participant in the crimes. The conflicting accounts meant that the court would have to consider the evidence surrounding her behavior during the days between the deaths at the Fugate home and the final arrest in Wyoming. The question was difficult precisely because the available accounts pointed in opposite directions. Starkweather said Fugate participated. Fugate said she was a hostage. There was no neutral narrator who could simply explain what happened inside the house and during the subsequent journey. As the separate proceedings moved forward, the case therefore became two intertwined stories. The prosecution of a 19-year-old man for a killing spree that had claimed 11 lives, and the prosecution of a 14-year-old girl whose role remained disputed. Starkweather's trial had produced the most severe possible result. The death penalty had been imposed and later upheld by the Nebraska Supreme Court. But before that sentence could be carried out, the courts would have to deal with the unresolved question of Carol Fugate. And beyond both trials remained a question that no verdict could completely erase. Why had the violence escalated so rapidly from one murder to 11? And how much of that escalation had been directed by Starkweather alone? The case against Charles Starkweather had ended with a death sentence. But the legal story of the killing spree was not finished. One crucial question remained. What responsibility belonged to Carol and Fugate? When the authorities captured her alongside Starkweather in Douglas, Wyoming, she was 14 years old. She had traveled with him through the final days of the spree, after 3 members of her family had been murdered. She had been present during a period in which 8 additional people were killed. And yet her own account of those days was fundamentally different from the story told by Starkweather. He portrayed her as an active participant. She portrayed herself as a frightened teenager under his control. The difference between those accounts would determine the course of her life. Fugate maintained that Starkweather had taken control of the situation after killing her family. According to her account, he told her that her relatives were being held hostage and threatened to kill her if she resisted him. She therefore argued that she remained with him because she feared for her own life. In this version of events, her presence beside Starkweather did not mean she supported the murders. It meant that she had been trapped in circumstances created by an armed and violent 19-year-old. Her age was impossible to ignore. She was 14 when the murders occurred. The legal system, therefore, had to confront a difficult question. Could a 14-year-old girl who claimed to have been threatened be treated as a willing participant in a killing spree? The prosecution's answer was effectively yes. Fugate was charged as an accomplice in the murders, including the killing of Robert Jensen. The state argued that her conduct during the spree demonstrated more than simple presence. Starkweather's statements were important to that argument because he claimed that Fugate had participated directly in some of the violence. His accusations included claims that she had used weapons against victims. Those allegations placed Fugate in a far more serious position than someone who merely knew about a crime. If the prosecution could establish that she had knowingly assisted Starkweather, she could be held criminally responsible for the murders despite not being the person who had physically carried out every killing. But Starkweather's statements had to be viewed carefully. He was himself responsible for the killings, and he had already been convicted. His descriptions of Fugate were therefore not neutral observations. He was a participant describing another participant, and his account could potentially affect how responsibility for the spree was understood. Fugate's defense relied on a different interpretation. She did not deny that she had been with Starkweather. She denied that her presence meant voluntary cooperation. Her claim was that fear controlled her decisions. The distinction was fundamental. An accomplice knowingly chooses to assist a crime. A hostage may remain at the scene because leaving would create an immediate threat to life. Fugate argued that her circumstances belonged to the second category. The court was therefore confronted with the problem of interpreting her actions through the context in which they occurred. The fact that she remained with Starkweather after the murders could be viewed in two radically different ways. Prosecutors could argue that she stayed because she was cooperating. The defense could argue that she stayed because she was afraid. The same physical fact could therefore support two completely different conclusions. The case also required the court to consider the sequence of events. Fugate's mother, stepfather, and young half-sister had been killed at the family home. Afterward, Starkweather and Fugate remained at the property and created the appearance that the family was ill. They later left together. They encountered August Meyer. They encountered Robert Jensen and Carol King. They returned to Lincoln. They went to the Ward residence, where C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel were killed. They then left Nebraska in the Ward family's Packard and continued toward Wyoming. Finally, Merle Collison was killed near Douglas. From the prosecution's perspective, Fugate had remained alongside Starkweather through this entire progression. The defense had to explain why a 14-year-old who was supposedly being held under threat would continue traveling with him through multiple locations and remain silent while additional people died. The answer was coercion. Fugate maintained that Starkweather's threats had prevented her from resisting. But proving coercion was far more difficult than simply claiming it. The court had to consider whether the circumstances supported her accounts strongly enough to overcome the prosecution's case. The trial, therefore, became not merely a question of what Fugate knew, but what she could have done and whether she reasonably believed that resistance would result in her own death. This distinction was particularly important because the murders had continued long after the killing of her family. By then, Fugate's situation had become increasingly complicated. She was no longer simply at the location where her family had been killed. She was traveling with Starkweather as he moved from one place to another and encountered new victims. To prosecutors, that continued association could appear to demonstrate cooperation. To Fugate, it was part of the captivity she claimed had begun inside her family home. The court ultimately rejected her account to the extent necessary to find her criminally responsible. Fugate was convicted in connection with the killing of Robert Jensen and received a sentence of life imprisonment. The verdict meant that the legal system did not accept her explanation that she had been merely a hostage. She was treated as a participant in the crime. For Fugate, however, the verdict did not end the controversy. Her case became one of the most debated elements of the entire Starkweather story. Some people continued to believe that she had knowingly assisted him. Others believed that she had been a 14-year-old victim trapped by a violent older boyfriend, whose actions she could not control. The phrase "the 12th victim" would later become associated with Fugate because of this interpretation. It reflected the belief that the killings had not only destroyed her family and changed the lives of the other victims' families, but had also transformed Fugate herself into another victim of Starkweather's violence. Yet calling her a victim does not resolve the historical question. The court had reached a different conclusion. Her conviction meant that, legally, she bore responsibility for her involvement in the killing of Jensen. The debate therefore continued outside the courtroom. Years later, Fugate's sentence would be reduced. In 1973, her sentence was changed to 30 to 50 years. In 1976, after approximately 18 years in prison, she was released. By then, the events of January 1958 were nearly 2 decades in the past. But they had not disappeared. The case remained part of American criminal history, and Fugate's role remained one of its most difficult unanswered questions. Her release did not produce a definitive resolution. Instead, it allowed the debate to continue in a different form. Was the court correct to treat her as an accomplice? Was her account of coercion credible? Did Starkweather accurately describe her involvement? Or was he attempting to shift some responsibility onto someone else? The historical record preserves the competing accounts, but it does not provide a simple answer that satisfies every interpretation. What can be established is that Fugate was 14, that she was present during the killing spree, that she was captured with Starkweather in Wyoming, that she was convicted as an accomplice, and that she consistently maintained that she had been threatened and controlled. The legal outcome and the historical debate therefore exist side by side. One says that Fugate was criminally responsible. The other continues to ask whether the circumstances of her age and alleged coercion should change, how her actions are understood. Meanwhile, Starkweather's own legal fate was already sealed. His conviction for first-degree murder had been upheld by the Nebraska Supreme Court on December 19, 1958. He was facing execution. Fugate, in contrast, would spend years in prison before eventually gaining her freedom. Their lives diverged after the trials, but the argument over what happened during those January days never completely disappeared. The case had begun with the murder of Robert Calvert and expanded into 11 deaths across Nebraska. In Wyoming, it ended with one defendant sentenced to death and another sentenced to life imprisonment. But behind those verdicts remained the victims themselves, people whose lives had been cut short before the legal arguments began. Robert Jensen and Carol King had stopped to help. Merle Collison had been asleep in his vehicle. Members of the Fugate family had been killed inside their own home. The other victims had likewise been drawn into the spree through circumstances that ultimately placed them in Starkweather's path. Their deaths were the foundation of the case. The arguments over Starkweather's mental state and Fugate's responsibility came afterward. And while the courts could issue verdicts, they could not fully answer every question about fear, coercion, motive, or the psychological path that had led to 11 deaths. For Carol Fugate, the consequences would continue for 18 years behind prison walls. For Charles Starkweather, there would be only one final legal chapter left. His appeal had failed. His death sentence stood. On June 25, 1959, he would be taken to the Nebraska State Penitentiary and executed in the electric chair. The killing spree itself had ended more than a year earlier, but the final consequence for its perpetrator was still approaching. The killing spree had ended in Wyoming, but the legal consequences continued long after the police pursuit. Charles Starkweather had been captured, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Yet a death sentence was not automatically the end of the legal process. His attorneys challenged the conviction, and the Nebraska Supreme Court was asked to review the case. For Starkweather, the appeal represented another opportunity to challenge the judgment that had placed him on death row. For the families of the victims, however, the legal process meant another period of waiting after the violence had already taken their loved ones. The case had begun with the killing of Robert Calvert in Lincoln in late 1957 and had escalated into 11 deaths across Nebraska and Wyoming. Now the courts had to determine whether the conviction and sentence should stand. One of the central issues throughout Starkweather's prosecution had been his mental condition. His defense had argued that psychological problems affected his ability to understand and control his actions and, more specifically, his ability to form the deliberate intent required for first-degree murder. This was not an attempt to deny that the killings had occurred. Starkweather himself had admitted responsibility for them. Instead, the defense sought to challenge the legal interpretation of his state of mind. The distinction was crucial. Criminal law does not simply ask whether a person caused a death. In a case involving the most serious murder charge, the law also asks questions about intent, deliberation, and responsibility. Starkweather's defense therefore attempted to place his conduct within the context of his mental condition. The prosecution had a very different interpretation. The state emphasized the sequence of events and Starkweather's behavior before and after individual killings. He had moved between locations. He had used vehicles belonging to victims. He had continued traveling after earlier murders. He had attempted to avoid capture. He had crossed from Nebraska into Wyoming. And after killing Merle Collison near Douglas, he attempted to leave in Collison's Buick. From the prosecution's perspective, those actions demonstrated awareness of his circumstances and an ability to make decisions. The argument was that Starkweather was not simply acting in a moment of uncontrollable confusion. He had repeatedly acted, moved, adapted, and attempted to escape. The jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's position sufficiently to convict him of first-degree murder in the Jensen case and impose the death penalty. But Starkweather's attorneys continued to challenge that outcome. The Nebraska Supreme Court reviewed the conviction and sentence. On December 19, 1958, the court upheld the judgment. The decision meant that Starkweather's death sentence remained in place. There would be no reversal that could return the case to the beginning. The legal system had reached its conclusion regarding his responsibility for the murder of Robert Jensen. Starkweather had been found legally responsible and sentenced to die. By the time the Nebraska Supreme Court affirmed the sentence, the public fascination with the case had already become enormous. The story had spread far beyond Lincoln and beyond the communities directly touched by the murders. Television played an important role in bringing the pursuit and subsequent legal proceedings to a national audience. The case had occurred at a moment when television was rapidly becoming a central part of American life, and the image of a 19-year-old killer moving through Nebraska and Wyoming captured widespread attention. Yet behind the national headlines were 11 separate deaths. Each victim had a family, relationships, routines, and a life that ended during Starkweather's spree. The legal proceedings necessarily focused on Starkweather, but the human consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. The conviction could not restore Robert Calvert's life. It could not undo the deaths of Velda Bartlett Fugate, Marion Bartlett, and Betty Jean Bartlett. It could not return August Meyer, Robert Jensen, Carole King, C. Lauer, Clara Ward, Lillian Finkel, or Merle Collison to their families. A verdict could establish legal responsibility, but it could not reverse what had happened. Starkweather remained on death row as the final stage approached. He had been 19 when he carried out the murders and 20 by the time he was executed. His youth became another aspect of the case that continued to attract attention. But his age did not erase the consequences of his actions. 11 people had died. The question before the authorities was no longer whether he would be punished, but when the sentence would be carried out. On June 25, 1959, approximately 17 months after his capture, Charles Starkweather was executed at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. He was put to death in the electric chair. The execution brought the formal legal history of his case to an end. A killing spree that had begun with Robert Calvert in late November 1957 and reached its final victim, Merle Collison, on January 29, 1958, had ended with Starkweather's execution. But the end of his life did not end the questions surrounding the case. The most persistent question concerned Carole and Fugate. Starkweather had repeatedly accused her of participating in the killings. Fugate maintained that she had been forced to remain with him. She had been 14 at the time of the murders. Her conviction had already established her legal responsibility in connection with Robert Jensen's death. But the historical debate over whether she was truly an accomplice remained unresolved. The later reduction of her sentence did not settle the issue. In 1973, her sentence was reduced to 30 to 50 years. In 1976, after approximately 18 years in prison, she was released. By then, the case had become part of American criminal history. Fugate had spent most of her adolescence and young adulthood behind prison walls, and she continued to maintain the basic account she had given about her relationship with Starkweather and the circumstances surrounding the spree. Some people continued to regard her as a willing participant. Others regarded her as another victim of the violence. The phrase "the 12th victim" became associated with the latter interpretation. The debate remains difficult because the central accounts come from people who had direct involvement in the events. Starkweather was the killer and had an obvious personal stake in how responsibility was portrayed. Fugate was the person whose freedom and future depended on convincing the court that she had been coerced. Neither account can be treated as completely neutral. That uncertainty has become one of the defining features of the case. The execution of Starkweather also left behind a broader question about how society understands violent offenders. It is tempting to search for one explanation that can make 11 deaths understandable: anger, alienation, personal conflict, poverty, rebellion, a troubled relationship, or mental illness. But none of these factors, by themselves, can explain the entire sequence. Starkweather had experienced frustrations and conflicts, but millions of people experience similar difficulties without becoming killers. His actions remain his responsibility. Understanding the background of a crime is not the same as excusing it. The court's rejection of his defense reflected that distinction. His psychological condition became relevant to the question of legal responsibility, but it did not erase the consequences of his choices. The final legal record, therefore, contains two important conclusions. First, Starkweather was found responsible for the murder of Robert Jensen and sentenced to death. Second, the Nebraska Supreme Court upheld that judgment on December 19, 1958. The execution followed on June 25, 1959. For the criminal justice system, those events brought closure. But for the families of the 11 victims, there could be no equivalent legal ending. Their loss did not disappear when Starkweather died. The case also left a lasting mark on Nebraska, Wyoming, and American popular culture. The rapid movement of the fugitives, the age of Starkweather and Fugate, the number of victims, and the nationwide media attention transformed the case into one of the most remembered American killing sprees of the 20th century. It was later reflected in films, literature, music, and discussions of violent youth offenders. Bruce Springsteen's song Nebraska, in particular, drew directly on the Starkweather story, helping preserve the case in American cultural memory. But cultural memory can sometimes distort reality. The image of the young outlaw, the restless rebel, or the doomed couple on the run can transform a tragedy into a kind of mythology. The actual case was much less romantic. 11 people were dead. Their deaths were not symbols. They were the destruction of individual lives. Starkweather's execution, therefore, should not be understood as the dramatic finale of an adventure. It was the final legal consequence of a sequence of crimes that had already devastated numerous families. The real story was not the journey of two young fugitives across the Great Plains. It was the lives interrupted along that journey. Robert Calvert, the first known victim, had been killed in Lincoln. The Fugate family had been destroyed inside their own home. August Meyer was killed near Bennett. Robert Jensen and Carol King were killed after stopping to help. C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel died at the Ward residence. Merle Collison became the final victim in Wyoming. Each death represented a separate loss, even though the victims were later grouped together under one infamous case. When Starkweather was executed, the legal system could finally say that his punishment had been carried out. But the deeper questions remained. Why did the violence escalate? Why did Starkweather continue after the first killing? What exactly happened between him and Fugate? And how should the actions of a 14-year-old girl be understood when she claimed that she had been threatened by a 19-year-old killer? Those questions would survive the execution. They would become part of the lasting legacy of the Starkweather case. A reminder that a courtroom can establish criminal responsibility while history continues to wrestle with the circumstances surrounding it. The execution of Charles Starkweather on June 25, 1959, brought the formal legal story of the Nebraska and Wyoming killing spree to an end, but it did not bring an end to the questions surrounding it. By the time Starkweather was executed at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, 11 people had been killed and 2 young lives had been permanently altered. Starkweather was dead, while Carol and Fugate remained imprisoned. The courts had reached their conclusions, but history continued to ask questions that a verdict could not completely resolve. Among all of them, one question remained more persistent than any other. Who was Carol and Fugate during those terrible days in January 1958? The legal record established that Fugate was convicted as an accomplice in connection with Robert Jensen's murder. She received a life sentence, which was later reduced to 30 to 50 years in 1973. In 1976, after approximately 18 years in prison, she was released. But her release did not settle the argument about her role. Her story remained fundamentally opposed to the story Starkweather had told investigators. Fugate maintained that she had been controlled by Starkweather. She said he threatened her and that she remained with him because she feared that resisting him would result in her own death. Her explanation placed her in the position of a hostage rather than a willing participant. The prosecution and the court reached a different conclusion. Starkweather had accused her of active participation in several killings, including allegations that she had used a gun or knife. Those accusations became part of the case against her. The problem was that Starkweather was not an impartial witness. He was the person responsible for the killings and had every reason to influence how others understood what had happened. His statements were extensive, but length did not guarantee certainty. His February 1st statements to County Attorney Elmer M. Shealy totaled 192 pages, and another statement given on February 27th ran to 164 pages. These records provide a substantial account of Starkweather's version of events, but they also preserve his accusations against Fugate. As a result, they became evidence in a dispute that has never completely disappeared. Fugate's age makes the question particularly difficult. She was 14 years old when the murders occurred. Starkweather was 19. The difference between them was not simply a number. It was part of the context in which Fugate's behavior has been interpreted ever since. If she voluntarily participated, then she was an accomplice who knowingly assisted a deadly crime spree. If she was coerced, then her continued presence beside Starkweather represented survival rather than cooperation. The same actions can appear very different depending on which interpretation is accepted. Remaining with Starkweather can be described as evidence of complicity, or it can be described as the behavior of someone who believed that resistance would place her own life in immediate danger. The historical record preserves the conflict, but it does not provide a universally accepted resolution. The question of motive is similarly difficult. Starkweather did not provide a single explanation capable of accounting for all 11 deaths. His background included frustration, anger, dissatisfaction, and a fascination with rebellious images in popular culture. He had worked laboring jobs, including collecting garbage, and he developed a sense of resentment and alienation that has often been discussed in accounts of the case. But none of those circumstances can be treated as a direct explanation for murder. To say that Starkweather felt rejected or angry is not to explain why 11 people died. Many people experience poverty, frustration, humiliation, conflict, or social rejection without becoming violent criminals. The killing spree must therefore be understood through Starkweather's individual choices and actions, rather than through a simplistic theory that one social circumstance caused everything that followed. The progression of the murders is itself one of the most disturbing elements of the case. The first known victim, Robert Calvert, was killed in late November 1957, approximately 2 months before the concentrated January spree. Starkweather did not immediately embark on a continuous series of murders after Calvert's death. Instead, the violence intensified dramatically in January 1958. On January 21st, Velda Bartlett Fugate, Marion Bartlett, and 2-year-old Betty Jean Bartlett were killed. 6 days later, August Meyer was murdered. Robert Jensen and Carol King were then killed after stopping to help Starkweather and Fugate. On January 28th, C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel were killed. On January 29th, Merle Collison became the final victim near Douglas, Wyoming. The speed of that escalation is central to understanding why the case is generally described as a killing spree rather than a conventional long-term serial murder pattern. The murders became concentrated over a matter of days, and the victims increasingly included strangers. This distinction matters because it demonstrates the expansion of danger. Starkweather's violence did not remain confined to one personal dispute. The victims moved from people connected to his immediate circumstances to people whose connection was simply that they crossed his path. Robert Jensen and Carole King had stopped to help. Merle Collison had been sleeping in his vehicle. Their deaths demonstrated how unpredictable the danger had become. There was no need for a prior personal relationship. A chance encounter could be enough. The geographical movement of the spree also contributed to its impact. The crimes began in Lincoln and expanded through Nebraska before reaching Wyoming. Starkweather and Fugate changed vehicles as they moved. After Jensen and King were killed, they used Jensen's vehicle. After the Ward murders, Starkweather took the family's Packard. After Collison was killed, he attempted to escape in the Buick. This movement forced law enforcement to respond across a widening area. The final pursuit in Douglas brought the search to an end, but by then the number of victims had already reached 11. The arrests also revealed another aspect of the case: the role of the media. The United States was entering an era in which television was becoming increasingly influential. The Starkweather pursuit became a national story, and the public followed the search for the young killer across the Great Plains. This helped transform the case from a regional tragedy into a national crime story. The attention also contributed to the lasting image of Starkweather as a symbol of violent youth. But there is a danger in reducing the case to an image. The more the story becomes a cultural myth, the easier it becomes to forget the individual victims. Their names can disappear beneath the reputation of the killer. The case is remembered as the Starkweather spree. But the people who died were not simply components of Starkweather's story. Robert Calvert was a person. Velda Bartlett Fugate was a person. Marion Bartlett was a person. Betty Jean Bartlett was a 2-year-old child. August Meyer, Robert Jensen, Carole King, C. Lauer, Clara Ward, Lillian Finkel, and Merle Collison were also individuals whose lives ended violently. Remembering the case responsibly requires keeping that distinction clear. The cultural legacy of Starkweather has sometimes made that difficult. His story has influenced films, literature, and music. Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska is one of the most recognizable examples, drawing directly from the Starkweather case. Such works can preserve historical memory, but they can also create an image of the killer that is detached from the reality of the victims. There is nothing romantic about a 19-year-old man killing 11 people. There is nothing adventurous about fleeing across state lines after multiple murders. And there is nothing heroic about the desperate actions that followed. The case is ultimately a story of loss, fear, criminal responsibility, and unanswered questions. It also illustrates the limitations of the justice system. Courts can determine guilt and impose punishment. They can decide whether a defendant is legally responsible. They can hear competing accounts and issue verdicts, but they cannot restore the dead. They cannot return a child to her family. They cannot undo the years of grief experienced by relatives. And they cannot always resolve every question about what happened inside the minds of the people involved. Starkweather's execution ended his legal story, but not the historical debate. Fugate's release in 1976 likewise ended her imprisonment, but not the questions about her role. The case remains difficult because it contains both clear facts and unresolved interpretation. 11 people died. Starkweather was responsible for the murders and was executed. Fugate was convicted as an accomplice and later released. Those facts are established. What remains debated is the extent of Fugate's participation, the exact motivations behind the escalation, and the psychological circumstances surrounding the spree. Perhaps the most important lesson is that understanding a crime does not require turning it into a simple story. Starkweather was not created by one insult, one job, one relationship, or one social problem. Fugate's role cannot be reduced to a single label without acknowledging the competing evidence and her age. And the victims cannot be reduced to numbers. The Starkweather case has survived in American memory for more than 6 decades because it contains elements that continue to disturb youth, sudden violence, strangers becoming victims, a nationwide manhunt, a disputed accomplice, and a death sentence carried out against a 19-year-old killer. But the enduring significance of the case should not lie in the mythology surrounding Starkweather. It should lie in remembering what the mythology can obscure. 11 people died during a rapid and devastating period of violence. Their lives were ended because Starkweather chose to kill. Whatever questions remain about his psychology or Fugate's role, that central fact does not change. The final chapter of the case, therefore, belongs not to the killer, but to the people whose lives were taken. Their names form the most important record left behind. And decades after the final gunshots, the pursuit, the trials, and the execution, the responsibility of remembering remains, not to glorify the person who caused the tragedy, but to understand the consequences of his actions and to keep the victims from disappearing behind the legend of the man who killed them. More than 6 decades have passed since Charles Starkweather's killing spree ended in Wyoming. Yet the case continues to occupy a disturbing place in American criminal history. The passage of time has changed the way the story is remembered, but it has not changed its most basic fact. 11 people lost their lives during a period of rapidly escalating violence between late 1957 and January 29, 1958. Starkweather was eventually convicted, sentenced to death, and executed. Carol and Fugate was convicted as an accomplice, imprisoned for approximately 18 years, and released in 1976. The courts reached their decisions, but the questions surrounding the case did not disappear with those verdicts. Perhaps the most important way to understand the Starkweather case is to step away from the image of the killer and return to the people whose lives were taken. The name Charles Starkweather became famous. The names of his victims were far less likely to become household words. Yet they are the reason the case matters. Robert Calvert was the first known victim. He was a 21-year-old employee at a gas station in Lincoln, Nebraska. His death in late November 1957 marked the beginning of the known sequence of killings. Starkweather later admitted responsibility for his murder. At that moment, there was no way for the people around Calvert to know that his death would eventually become connected to 10 more killings. The violence did not immediately continue as an uninterrupted spree. Weeks passed before the concentrated series of murders began in January 1958. That period is important because it shows that the eventual tragedy was not one single continuous event. It developed over time and then suddenly accelerated. On January 21st, the violence reached the home of Carol Fugate's family. Velda Bartlett Fugate, Marion Bartlett, and 2-year-old Betty Jean Bartlett were killed. 3 members of one family were gone. Their deaths also created the circumstances in which Carol Fugate would become permanently connected to the case. From that point forward, her story and the story of Starkweather became inseparable in the public imagination. But the victims should not be remembered merely as the people surrounding a controversial defendant. Velda was a mother. Marion was a husband and stepfather. Betty Jean was a very young child. Their lives were individual lives, not simply entries in a criminal case file. The killing of the Fugate family also introduced one of the central questions that would remain unresolved in the public mind. What happened to Carol during and after the murders? Fugate said Starkweather had threatened her and forced her to remain with him. Starkweather claimed she participated. The courts ultimately convicted her, but the debate over her role has continued. 6 days after the murders at the Fugate residence, the violence expanded beyond the immediate circle of people connected to Carol. August Meyer was killed near Bennett, Nebraska. The case was no longer confined to a family tragedy. Then came Robert Jensen and Carol King. Their deaths illustrate perhaps more clearly than any others how unpredictable the spree had become. They encountered Starkweather and Fugate after their vehicle became stuck and stopped to help. They had no known personal reason to be involved in the conflict surrounding the Fugate family. They were simply people who responded to a situation in which someone appeared to need assistance. That decision ended their lives. Their deaths demonstrate the terrifying randomness that can emerge during a killing spree. A person does not necessarily become a victim because of something they have done. Sometimes the only connection is proximity. Jensen and King became part of the tragedy because their path crossed that of Starkweather. After their deaths, the fugitives returned to Lincoln, where the killings continued. On January 28th, C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel were killed at the Ward residence. 3 more lives were lost in a single location. Starkweather then took the family's Packard and left Nebraska with Fugate. The geography of the case now extended beyond Lincoln and beyond the immediate area in which the earlier murders had occurred. They were moving toward Wyoming, and the investigation had become a regional manhunt. The final victim was Merle Collison. On January 29th, near Douglas, Wyoming, Starkweather and Fugate encountered Collison inside a Buick. Collison was a traveling salesman who was sleeping in the vehicle. Starkweather killed him and attempted to take the Buick. This final murder was followed by the event that brought the entire spree to an end: the police pursuit and capture of Starkweather and Fugate. 11 deaths had occurred. The search was over. For law enforcement, the arrest marked a decisive moment. For the families of the victims, however, it could never represent a complete ending. The capture of the killer could not undo the deaths. The trial could establish responsibility. The sentence could impose punishment. The execution could bring the legal process to its ultimate conclusion. None of those events could restore the people who had been lost. This distinction is essential when considering true crime. The legal case naturally focuses attention on the offender because the state must prove guilt and determine punishment. The media often reinforces that focus because the offender becomes the central figure in the narrative. But a responsible account should resist allowing the perpetrator to become more important than the victims. The Starkweather case is particularly vulnerable to this problem because Starkweather became a cultural figure after the murders. His age, the speed of the spree, the interstate flight, the pursuit in Wyoming, and the controversy surrounding Fugate all contributed to the creation of a powerful public narrative. Over time, the story entered American popular culture. Bruce Springsteen's song Nebraska is one example of how the case was transformed into art. Other works also drew upon the story, contributing to the continued visibility of Starkweather's name. Cultural attention can preserve history, but it can also create distance from reality. The phrase killing spree can become abstract. A list of 11 names can become a statistic. A photograph of a young killer can become more familiar than photographs or stories of the people he killed. That is why remembering the victims matters. Their deaths were not fictional events constructed for entertainment. They were irreversible losses experienced by families and communities. The case also raises broader questions about the way society interprets violent crime. Starkweather's background has often been examined for possible explanations. His frustrations, anger, dissatisfaction, and sense of alienation have been discussed. His interest in rebellious images from popular culture has also been noted. But no single factor can explain why he killed 11 people. It would be misleading to suggest that difficult circumstances automatically create violent offenders. Millions of people experience hardship, rejection, anger, or conflict without committing murder. Understanding background is useful only when it is separated from excuses. The same principle applies to the question of mental responsibility. Starkweather's defense raised issues concerning his psychological condition and whether he was capable of forming the deliberate intent required for first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that his actions demonstrated awareness and purposeful behavior. The court ultimately rejected the defense sufficiently to convict him, and the Nebraska Supreme Court upheld the conviction and death sentence on December 19, 1958. His execution followed on June 25, 1959. The legal record therefore established responsibility, but it did not provide a complete psychological explanation for the spree. That distinction remains important. A court can determine whether a defendant is legally responsible without discovering every reason that led to the crime. Likewise, history can reconstruct a timeline without entering the minds of the people involved. The same uncertainty surrounds Fugate. Her conviction established legal responsibility in connection with Robert Jensen's murder. But her claim that she had been threatened and controlled has continued to generate debate. Her age makes the question especially difficult. She was 14. Starkweather was 19. The court ultimately rejected the interpretation of her as merely a hostage. But the historical argument has never completely disappeared. Some continue to believe she was a willing accomplice. Others regard her as another victim of Starkweather's control. The available accounts do not produce an easy answer, and responsible storytelling should acknowledge that uncertainty rather than pretending that every question has been solved. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Starkweather case is the danger of allowing a murderer's identity to eclipse the people he killed. Charles Starkweather became famous because of what he did. The victims did not choose to become part of history. Robert Calvert did not choose to become the first known victim. The Fugate family did not choose the violence that destroyed their home. August Meyer did not choose to encounter Starkweather. Robert Jensen and Carole King stopped to help and never returned home. C. Lauer, Clara Ward, and Lillian Finkel were killed inside the Ward residence. Merle Collison was killed while sleeping in his vehicle. Their lives were larger than the circumstances of their deaths. Their names deserve to remain attached to the story not simply as numbers, but as reminders that every entry in the list represented a person who mattered to someone. The Starkweather case has survived because it contains unanswered questions, dramatic legal proceedings, a national manhunt, and a deeply disputed relationship between two young people. But the final measure of the tragedy is simpler. 11 lives were lost. A 19-year-old man was held legally responsible. A 14-year-old girl spent approximately 18 years in prison after being convicted as his accomplice. The courts eventually closed the files, but memory did not close with them. And perhaps that is where the story should finally rest, not with the mythology of the killer, not with the fascination of the chase, and not with the image of an infamous young criminal, but with the ordinary lives that were violently interrupted. The lasting responsibility is to remember that behind every number in a true crime case is a human being, and behind every headline is a family that had to continue living after the story ended.